The day Ada Reed decided she was done with the world did not seem to notice. And that, she supposed, was exactly the point. She walked the length of the main road through Caldwell, Kansas in the summer of 1879, with nothing but a worn canvas bag slung over one shoulder and boots that had long since given up their argument with the dry, cracked earth beneath them. The sun was merciless. It pressed down on the backs of people's necks like a hand that wanted something from them, and the dust rose in little plumes around every footfall, coating the hems of her gray dress in a brownish powder that she no longer had the spirit to brush away. She had been walking since dawn, which meant she had been walking for close to 8 hours, and she had not eaten since the morning before last, a cold biscuit someone had left on a windowsill in Winfield that she had taken with the kind of quiet desperation a person feels when they have moved past shame entirely. Ada Reed was 24 years old. She had dark hair that was the color of strong coffee, and eyes that sat somewhere between brown and amber depending on the light, and she had a way of holding her jaw that made her look as though she was deciding something even when she had already decided everything, and found none of it worth the trouble. She was not a woman who attracted a great deal of attention in the way that some women did. She was not loud, not soft, not particularly strange. She was the kind of woman a man's eyes passed over on their way to something more interesting, and she had long since made her peace with that. Or so she told herself. The truth, which she had been carrying like a stone in her chest since March, was that she had left Wichita with nothing because she had arrived in Wichita with nothing. The job at the laundry had lasted 4 months before the owner decided he could get a younger girl for less money. The room she rented above the grain merchant had lasted 2 weeks after the job ended before the landlord, a man with thin fingers and thinner patience, had come knocking with an expression that made clear the arrangement was concluded. She had no family left to speak of. Her mother had died of fever when Ada was 16. Her father had ridden off to follow some mine or other when she was 9, and had never found his way back. She had a distant aunt somewhere in the direction of Texas whom she had never met and whose name she could not fully recall, and that was the whole of her family tree. So she walked. Caldwell was supposed to be a stepping stone. She had heard there was work to be had in the cattle towns along the Kisham Trail corridor, honest work, cooking and cleaning and mending, the kind of labor that required 2 hands and a willingness to show up, both of which she still possessed. She intended to find a boarding house, clean herself up, ask around. She had a plan. The plan was thin, barely the width of paper, but it was hers and she was holding to it. What she did not have was any money left for food. She had 3 cents. 3 copper pennies that she had found in the lining of her bag when she had searched it very thoroughly that morning while sitting on a fence post outside of town. 3 cents would not buy her a meal in any establishment in Caldwell, which she knew because she had already walked past 2 of them and looked at the boards outside. The smell coming from the second one, a place called Mabel's Table, which appeared to be a boarding house with a dining room, had nearly undone her. Roasted meat and something sweet, corn bread perhaps, and coffee so strong and dark it reached her from 10 feet away and made her stomach seize up with a longing that was almost painful. She had kept walking. She was nobody worth stopping for, she reasoned. She had nothing to offer, nowhere to be, no name that meant anything in this town or any other. The people of Caldwell were busy with their own concerns. The cattle season was in full swing. The trail herds coming up from Texas were beginning to arrive, and the town was noisy and full, and had no particular interest in a dusty woman with 3 cents and a canvas bag. Ada was accustomed to this kind of invisibility. She had been practicing it her whole life. She was standing at the far end of the main road, near the livery stable where the smell of hay and horses replaced the smell of dust and frying meat, trying to determine which direction would be most useful to walk in next, when she heard the horse. Not the noise of a horse, there were horses everywhere, tied at rails, pulling wagons, being led by boys in suspenders. She heard this particular horse because it stopped. She heard the specific sound of hooves pulling up short, the way the rhythm changed from forward movement to stillness, and then she heard leather creak and boots hit the ground close behind her. She did not turn around. "Ma'am." The voice was low and unhurried, not the voice of a man who said a lot of words at once. She turned, because there was no polite way not to, and found herself looking at a man she had never seen before, which was not surprising given she had never been to Caldwell in her life. He was tall, not extraordinarily so, but tall enough that she had to adjust her gaze upward by several degrees. He wore a hat the color of old bark, pushed back on his head in the manner of a man who had been riding all day, and had stopped caring about the precise angle of his brim somewhere around noon. His shirt was blue and faded and rolled at the sleeves. He had a face that was weathered in the way that all men's faces were weathered out here, lined around the eyes from squinting into sun and wind, jaw rough with 2 or 3 days of growth. He was maybe 30, give or take, and he had dark eyes that were looking at her with an expression she could not immediately identify, not pity, not the kind of appraisal that made her want to step back, but something more careful than either of those. He had a horse with him, a bay with a white blaze on its forehead, and on the horse's back there were saddlebags and a bedroll and the general accumulation of gear that indicated a man who spent considerable time on the road. He looked like a dozen other cowboys she had passed through half a dozen other towns, but he had stopped. "You passing through?" he asked. "I am," Ada said, because it was the simplest truth available. He nodded once, taking that in the way a man takes information he intends to use. Then he said in the same unhurried way, "Have you eaten today?" Ada stared at him. Nobody asked that. In her experience of the world, which was not inconsiderable, nobody stopped a stranger on the road and asked if they had eaten. They asked for directions, they asked if you had seen their cattle, they occasionally asked your name if they wanted something from you. They did not ask about food unless they were selling it or you were their guest, and she was neither of those things. "That's not any of your business," she said, which was not unfriendly exactly, but was the kind of answer that communicates clearly that a person is not accustomed to being asked. He did not seem offended. He tilted his head slightly, the way a man does when he is recalibrating, and said, "No, it is not. I apologize if that was forward." A brief pause. "But I have not eaten since morning, and I am going to Mabel's to remedy that situation, and the offer stands if you want company at the table." Ada looked at him for a long moment. The 3 pennies were in her coat pocket. She could feel their small weight there, their absolute insufficiency for the occasion. "I am not in a position to pay for a meal," she said. She said it flatly, without apology, because she had learned that the flat truth was less humiliating than the explained truth. "I know," he said, just those 2 words, and then he waited. "You don't know anything about me," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I know what 8 hours of walking in this heat looks like on a person." He said it without drama, without making it into something she needed to respond to. Then he untied his horse from where he had stopped it near a hitching post and nodded in the direction of Mabel's table. "Wesley Keene," he said, which she understood to mean he was introducing himself. She stood there in the dust and the heat, and she told herself she was nobody worth stopping for, that whatever this man's reasons were, they were not the right ones, that the world did not simply offer meals to women walking alone on road's ends. She told herself all of that, and it was completely true, and she was very hungry. "Ada Reed," she said, and she walked with him. Mabel's table was full in the way that cattle towns were full in the height of the driving season, loud and warm and smelling powerfully of grease and coffee, and the particular closeness of too many bodies in too small a room. There were cowboys fresh off the trail, their faces still carrying the dust of Oklahoma territory, and merchants in vests, and a couple of women Ada suspected were not there for the food exactly. The woman behind the counter, who was presumably Mabel, was large and fast-moving with red cheeks and an expression that suggested she had seen everything twice and found very little of it surprising. Wesley found a table near the side window without appearing to look for it. tied his horse outside, hung his hat on the wall peg that every establishment in every cattle town had near the door, and sat down across from Ada with the ease of a man who was comfortable in most places. He ordered 2 beef dinners and coffee for both of them without consulting a menu. There was no menu, and then leaned back in his chair and looked at her. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "Wherever there is work," Ada said. He accepted this. "What kind of work?" "Cooking, cleaning, mending, whatever is wanted." She paused, then added, because honesty seemed the policy he was operating under and she had nothing to lose, "I had a position in Wichita. It ended. I am trying to find another one." "You have family somewhere?" "No." He nodded as though this was information he had suspected. "I passed through Caldwell 2 days ago heading south," he said. "Coming back through now. There's a rancher out east of town about 4 miles who's been looking for a housekeeper. His wife died last winter. He has 3 children." He paused. "I am not vouching for the man's personality. I only know he is looking." Ada looked at him across the table. The food arrived, actual plates of food. Beef and gravy and potatoes and corn bread and coffee, so dark it was nearly black. And for a moment she could not speak, because the smell of it required her complete attention, and something was happening behind her eyes that she was not going to let turn into tears in a public dining room. "Are you a regular benefactor of strangers?" she asked once she had taken 2 bites and the most urgent edge of her hunger had been addressed. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "No," he said. "I generally mind my own business." "Then why did you stop?" He was quiet for a moment, drinking his coffee. Then he said, "I watched you walk past that boarding house twice. You slowed down both times." Another pause. "I grew up hungry. I know what it looks like." Ada set down her fork. There was nothing in his face that asked for her pity or her gratitude or her acknowledgement of what he had just said. He offered it the way a man offers a fact. "Here it is. Take it or leave it," and went back to eating his food. But the thing he had said sat between them on the table, and it changed something, the way a very small and precise movement can change the balance of a whole thing. "I am not someone who accepts charity easily," she said. "I know that too," he said. "You stood there for about 30 seconds deciding whether to walk away before you gave me your name." "I almost did walk away." "I know." And there was the thing adjacent to a smile again. "I'm glad you did not." Ada ate her meal. It was the best meal she had eaten in longer than she could calculate, which was partly about actual quality, and partly about the fact that she had been very hungry, and partly about the strange, warm ease of sitting across from a man who had stopped for no good reason and asked a simple, direct question, and had not made it into anything more complicated than it needed to be. She learned things about Wesley Keene in the way you learn things about a person when they are not trying to perform themselves at you. He was from Missouri originally, from a small farm that had failed the way a great many small farms in Missouri failed slowly, and then all at once. He had come west at 20, had worked cattle drives for 6 years, had saved enough to put a stake in a small piece of land outside of Caldwell that he was in the process of turning into something viable. He was 30 years old. He drove cattle on contract during the season to supplement what the land produced, which was not yet very much. He had a dog named Hector who was at the ranch with his neighbor Caleb, who was watching the property while Wesley was on the road. "A ranch," Ada said. "How much of it?" 320 acres. Half of it good grass, the rest is trying to decide what it wants to be." He considered. "I have 12 head of cattle and a kitchen garden that Hector mostly eats." "Hector eats the garden. He's partial to the beans." Ada laughed. It came out before she decided to let it, which surprised her. She was not, as a general rule, someone who laughed easily, especially not in front of strangers. But it was there, genuine and unguarded, and the look that passed across Wesley Keene's face when he heard it was something she filed away without letting herself examine what it meant. After dinner she asked Mabel about the rancher east of town, a man named Hobbs, and Mabel said that yes, he was looking, and yes, she could put in a word if Ada wanted to ride out in the morning. Ada said she would walk. Mabel looked at her boots and said nothing, which was the kindness of a woman who understood practical situations. Wesley was standing at the door paying when Ada came over with her 3 pennies. She held them out. He looked at them. He looked at her. "You keep those," he said. "Wesley, you may need them more than I do tomorrow." He said it without looking at her, addressing the statement to the middle distance in the manner of a man who did not want to turn a practical observation into an argument. "Good luck with Hobbs. He's gruff, but I don't think he's unkind." "How do you know him?" "I've bought hay from him twice." He took his hat from the peg and settled it on his head with the practiced ease of habit, and then he looked at her directly for the first time since he had paid that careful, unhurried look. "Take care of yourself, Ada Reed." She wanted to say something that equaled what he had done, something that acknowledged the weight of being seen by a person who had no obligation to see you. But she did not have the right words, and she suspected he would not have wanted a great production of gratitude in any case, and so she said, "Thank you, Wesley Keene. I mean that plainly." He nodded once. Then he walked out the door, and she heard his horse move off down the road, and she stood in Mabel's doorway with 3 copper pennies in her hand, and something new and tentative starting very quietly in her chest. She slept that night in a corner of Mabel's storeroom, which Mabel offered with a directness that suggested she was a woman who made decisions based on what she saw in front of her. And Ada Reed had apparently passed whatever informal assessment Mabel had been running since she walked through the door. The storeroom had flour sacks and a folded horse blanket, and it was dry and out of the wind, which was more than Ada had had most of the previous week, and she lay on her canvas bag and stared at the dark ceiling and thought, against her own advice to herself, about a man with a faded blue shirt who had grown up hungry and had stopped anyway. She arrived at the Hobbs ranch the next morning, having walked the 4 miles in boots that were increasingly making their opinions known. Henry Hobbs was, as Wesley had suggested, gruff, a wide, heavy-set man in his 50s with a beard that had gone mostly gray, and a voice that came out like gravel being shifted around in a barrel. He had 3 children, a girl of 14 named June, a boy of 11 named Thomas, and a boy of 7 named Sam who had his dead mother's eyes and the expression of someone who was still deciding whether the world was to be trusted. Ada got the position. It paid $12 a month plus room and board, which was modest but livable, and the room was a small one off the kitchen with a real bed and a window that looked south toward a low ridge of hills that turned amber in the evening light. She started that same afternoon, taking stock of the kitchen, which had been running on Henry Hobbs's limited abilities for 7 months, and showed it in ways that were both clear and correctable. She cooked a proper dinner, that first night beef stew with the dried herbs she found in the back of the pantry, and biscuits that rose the way biscuits were supposed to rise, and a dried apple cake that she made because there were dried apples and sugar, and she thought the children needed something sweet. She watched Sam eat 3 pieces of that cake, and something in her chest did the same thing it had done when Wesley Keene had smiled at the sound of her laughing, which was to soften in a way she had not planned for. The weeks passed. Ada settled into the rhythm of the Hobbs household the way water settles into a riverbed, finding the natural channels, filling the spaces that needed filling, becoming necessary without making a performance of it. June helped in the kitchen and was sharp and sensible, and reminded Ada uncomfortably of herself at 14, which meant she was sometimes brusque and sometimes lonely and needed things she would not admit to needing. Thomas was constantly underfoot with questions about the practical operation of everything, how the bread rose, why the stove drew better from the south, where wind came from. Sam was quieter, but he had taken to sitting near wherever Ada was working, not talking, just present, in the way that very young children sometimes attach themselves to warmth the way plants turn toward light. Henry Hobbs himself was not a complicated man. He had loved his wife. He was running on the empty feeling of her absence and the imperative of his children and the work of the ranch, in roughly that order. He was not unkind to Ada, but he was also not particularly present with her, and she understood this as grief and did not take it personally. It was a good position. She had warmth, food, money, a place to be. She told herself that was more than enough and that she was grateful for it and that she was not thinking about Wesley Keene. She thought about Wesley Keene. She could not have explained precisely why. He was a stranger. She had eaten one meal with him and exchanged perhaps 40 sentences. But there was something in the quality of how he had seen her. Not her need exactly, though he had seen that too, but her. The person trying to walk past the boarding house with dignity intact, that had gotten under her skin in a way she could not entirely extract. She asked Mabel about him when she came into town a month later on her first afternoon off. Mabel was the kind of woman who knew everything about everybody within a 20-mile radius, and she confirmed that yes, Wesley Keene was a known quantity in Caldwell, had been coming through for years during the cattle season, had bought land 3 years back, was considered reliable and fair by the people who did business with him. "Good man," Mabel said, in the voice of a woman for whom that phrase had precise and limited application. "Quiet, doesn't trouble anybody. Is he here often?" Ada asked and then wished she had been more oblique about it. Mabel gave her a look that was knowing without being unkind. "He comes in every few weeks, usually stops here." She paused, pouring coffee. "He asked about you as a matter of fact. He asked about me, wanted to know if you'd found a position. I told him yes and that you seemed to be managing fine." Mabel set the coffee pot down with the decisive click of a woman who had concluded a sentence. He seemed glad to hear it. Ada wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and looked out the window at the main road. The cattle season was still running, and the road was active with the usual commerce of a trail town, men and horses and wagons, the distant sound of drovers moving a herd down toward the stockyards at the edge of town. It was a loud, busy, vivid world, this cattle country, with its own particular rhythms and rules and the constant sense of something moving through. "Thank you," Ada said, and finished her coffee. It was a Saturday in late September when Wesley Keene came back. Ada was in town with Sam, who had been promised a visit to the general store for new bootlaces and had treated this errand with the gravity of a significant diplomatic mission. She was standing at the counter waiting for the proprietor to find the correct size when the door opened, and she heard the particular way that hardware moved spurs. She recognized now, having lived among working cowboys for 2 months, and she turned and Wesley Keene walked in. He saw her at almost the same moment. Something in his expression, that measured, careful face, shifted, not dramatically. A small adjustment, like a man who was surprised by something pleasant and was taking a moment to decide what to do with it. "Ada Reed," he said. "Wesley Keene," she said. They looked at each other for a moment across the store, which was small enough that it barely qualified as a distance. "This is Sam," she said, because Sam was standing at her side looking at the newcomer with 7-year-old frankness. "Sam Hobbs. Sam, this is Mr. Keene." "How do," Sam said. "How do," Wesley said gravely, which Sam appeared to find satisfactory. The proprietor returned with the bootlaces and Ada paid for them with some of her wages, and then they were at the door at the same time, and it would have been strange not to walk out together, and so they walked out together onto the porch, and Sam immediately found something in the street to be fascinated by, a wagon horse with an unusual blaze, and ran over to it. "Are you well?" Wesley asked. It was a simple question, but he asked it in the way he had asked if she had eaten, with a quality of actual interest that she had noticed was not as common as one might hope. "I am well," she said. "I found the position at Hobbs's the next morning. I have been there 2 months. Is it good work?" "It is. The children they need someone, and I like being needed. And Hobbs, he is grieving, but he is fair." She looked at him sideways. "You asked Mabel about me." Wesley looked briefly as though he might deflect that, and then seemed to decide against it. "I wanted to know you were settled," he said simply. "You looked like you had been having a hard run of it." "I had," she said. "You did not need to concern yourself." "No," he agreed, "but I thought about it anyway." They were standing in the September light on the porch of the general store, the sounds of Caldwell around them, horses and voices, and somewhere nearby a fiddle that someone was tuning up for the Saturday evening. And Ada thought about the flat certainty with which she had told herself she was nobody worth stopping for, and how completely wrong it had turned out to be, based on the evidence of the man standing beside her. "Do you have time?" she asked. "For coffee?" "Sam will need to go back soon, but I have time," Wesley said. They went back to Mabel's, which was becoming something of a fixed point for them, and sat at the same table near the side window. And the conversation this time was different because they were not strangers exactly, but also not yet something with a name. They talked for an hour and a half. She told him more about Wichita, the job, the room, the slow erosion of options. And he listened with the full, quiet attention of a man who did not feel the need to fill every silence with a response. He told her more about the ranch, about the work of turning raw prairie land into something productive, about the way the Kansas sky behaved in October when the weather began to shift, about Hector the bee-eating dog. Sam sat between them and ate a molasses cookie and contributed observations about the wagon horse and the bootlaces and the relative merits of different types of biscuits, and Wesley answered all of Sam's observations with the same seriousness he brought to everything, and Sam declared him all right on the walk back to where Ada had left the Hobbs wagon. "He is high praise from Sam," Ada said. "I gathered." Wesley stood by his horse, the same bay with the white blaze, whom Ada had begun thinking of as an old acquaintance. "I will be through again in a few weeks. I will likely be in town on Saturdays," she said. He looked at her, that careful, unhurried look. "Then I'll look for you on Saturdays." And he rode off, and Ada drove the wagon back to the Hobbs ranch in the golden Kansas afternoon, with Sam asleep against her shoulder, and something in her chest that was no longer cautious, but was becoming something more certain and more frightening, in the way that all good things are frightening when you have spent a long time not having them. October came in with cool air and big skies. The cattle drives were winding down, the season ran roughly from spring through fall, and by October most of the herds had come through, been sold at the stockyards, and the drovers were drifting back toward Texas to do it again next year. Caldwell quieted some, settling from its frenetic summer pitch to something more sustainable and human in scale. Ada found, to her own surprise, that she had something like a life. The work at the Hobbs ranch had taken on the shape of routine, which was a thing she had not had in several years, and which turned out to feel quite good. She knew where things were. She knew the particular creak of Sam's step on the stairs when he came down before the others in the morning, and she knew that June liked her coffee with a great deal of sugar and would be embarrassed if you noticed. And she knew that Thomas would eat anything put in front of him without complaint except for turnips, about which he had deeply held opinions. Henry Hobbs had begun to emerge slightly from the fog of his grief. He had started coming to dinner instead of eating alone in his office, had started asking Ada practical questions about the household, had started showing a wry, dry humor that surprised and pleased her. Wesley came back on the third Saturday of October, and then again 2 weeks after that, and by the second visit, it had become something understood between them that Saturday afternoons in Caldwell were theirs. They walked the town sometimes, or sat at Mabel's, or on one occasion drove out to the edge of town to watch the sun go down behind the low hills in the west, because he had mentioned that he liked to do that, and she had said she had not done it since she was a girl. And the experience of watching the Kansas sky turn from blue to orange to the deep bruised purple of a plains evening was one she had not anticipated needing as much as she apparently did. He was easy to be with. That was the thing she kept returning to. She had been braced in the early weeks for the usual undertow, the way men sometimes wanted something in return for their attention, the way kindness had conditions written into it in small print. But Wesley Keene seemed to want nothing except to be in her company, and to talk, and to listen, and to share the occasional meal, and she gradually stopped bracing herself and let herself simply be present with him. She had not been in love before. She had been close to it once at 17, with a boy in the town where she and her mother had been living, a boy with red hair and a kind mouth who had moved away by the following spring and whom she had not thought about in years. But this was different. This was not the fluttery, anxious feeling of 17. This was something quieter and more durable, something that built steadily the way a fire builds when the wood is properly laid, a growing warmth, a sense of being oriented towards someone the way a compass needle is oriented, unable to point elsewhere regardless of which direction you turn. She was afraid of it. That was also true, and she knew it. In November, 3 things happened. The first was that Henry Hobbs sat down with Ada after dinner on a Tuesday evening and told her, in his gravel and boulder way, that he appreciated her work and her care, and that the children were doing better than they had since their mother died. And he said it looking at the table rather than at her. And she understood that for Henry Hobbs, this was an exceptionally personal communication, and she thanked him quietly, and neither of them made it into anything larger than it was, which was how they both preferred things. The second was that June came to Ada on a Friday night, after the boys were in bed, and sat on the edge of the kitchen table and said, with the blunt directness of a 14-year-old who has decided to trust someone, "I miss my mama." And Ada had put the dish she was drying down and said, "I know." And June had cried, the kind of crying that had been waiting months for permission. And Ada had let her cry and had not told her to stop, or that it would be all right because she had been 16 when her own mother died, and she knew it would be all right eventually, but that eventually was not the point and not what was needed right then. The third thing was that Wesley Keene asked Ada to come and see the ranch. He asked her on a Saturday afternoon at the end of November, when the air had gone cold and clear in the way of Kansas November, and their breath was visible as they walked the main road. He said it plainly, as he said most things. He had made some improvements to the house since fall, and he thought she might want to see them, and there was a particular view of the South Hills from the east pasture that he wanted to show her, and Hector had destroyed the remainder of the bean garden, and it was probably better to acknowledge that chapter was closed. Ada looked at him and understood that this was more than it was stated to be, and she suspected he understood that she understood this, and she said yes. She arranged with Henry Hobbs to take a Sunday afternoon the following week, which he gave her without question or comment, and Wesley came to collect her in his wagon. The horse with the white blaze was hitched to it, which she had not seen him in wagon harness before, and the horse appeared to find the arrangement dignified enough, and they drove out the 4 miles east through the morning cold. The ranch was small but solid. The house was a 1.5-story structure, built from timber and sod in the way of Kansas construction, with a porch that faced south toward those hills he had mentioned. There was a barn, a chicken coop, a corral, a kitchen garden that was dormant now but whose layout she could see long beds, well planned, that had perhaps at some point produced more than beans for Hector. The land ran out to a gentle horizon in all directions, flat and enormous and impossibly sky-heavy in the way of the plains. Hector came around the side of the barn when they arrived. He was a large, rangy dog of no particular ancestry that was obviously felt to be very important to him personally, brown with a white chest, and he went directly to Ada and pushed his large head against her hand with the confidence of a creature who expected to be welcomed everywhere. "He likes you," Wesley said. "He is after my pockets," Ada said. "He has assessed me as a food source." "He likes everybody," Wesley admitted, "but he does not usually go to people that fast." She bent and scratched behind the dog's ears, and Hector leaned into her with the whole weight of his approval, and she looked up at Wesley over the dog's head, and he was looking at her with that expression she was coming to know, that particular quality of attention, open and unguarded in a way his face was not always unguarded, and she felt the warmth in her chest grow and grow. He showed her the house. It was clean, a man's clean, which meant things were neat, but the curtains were not hemmed quite right, and the rugs could use beating with a kitchen, A sitting room, 2 bedrooms, and the loft above. There was a good stove and a solid table and shelves that he had built himself. She could tell because they were level and well fitted and had the slight imperfection of something made by hands learning their craft through practice. "You built the shelves," she said. "Last winter," he said. "I had the wood and the time." He was looking at the shelves as she was, assessing them. "They are not beautiful. They are sturdy," she said. "That is more important." He looked at her then. The light was coming through the south window at an angle that made the room golden, and they were standing in the kitchen of this small house on this piece of Kansas prairie that he had been making into a home. And Ada Reed thought about all the roads she had walked and all the places she had been nobody. And the clean, clear knowledge she had been trying to avoid for the past 2 months arrived now without any softening, full and unambiguous. She was in love with this man. She turned to the window because her face was doing something she was not prepared to have be public. "The view is what you said," she managed. He came and stood beside her at the window, not touching her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold air of the kitchen. They looked out at the south hills together, and after a moment he said, "Ada." She turned. "I want to ask you something," Wesley said, "and I want to ask it plainly because I do not know any other way." He looked at her with a directness that was serious and slightly vulnerable in the way of a man who does not often let himself be vulnerable. "I would like to keep seeing you, as more than as something with a name, if that is something you want." Ada looked at him. The late November light was coming through the window, and Hector was lying on the kitchen floor between them with his chin on his paws, and outside the Kansas sky was huge and pale, and the south hills were amber in the cold. "Yes," she said, "that is something I want." Something shifted in him then, a visible easing, like a held breath released, and the thing adjacent to a smile was there again, and this time it became an actual smile, brief and genuine, and it changed his whole face in a way she filed away in that interior place where she kept the things about him she did not want to forget. "Good," he said. "Good," she said. They had lunch. He had packed it. Cold chicken and bread and dried apple slices and coffee from a pot he warmed on the stove. And they sat at his table and talked for 3 hours. The way they had talked at Mabel's, but differently now, with the space between them altered, warmer and more certain. And Hector slept at their feet, and the afternoon light moved across the floor, and Ada thought that she had not felt at home somewhere in so long she had nearly forgotten what it felt like. And this feeling was not unlike that. He drove her back to the Hobbs ranch before dark, and when they reached the gate he helped her down from the wagon and they stood in the purple dusk, and he held her hand for a moment between both of his warm, calloused, steady, and said, "Saturday," in the way he had come to say it, as a small sufficient promise, and she said Saturday back. She walked to the house in the dark with the shape of something in her chest that was too large to fit quietly, and she did not try to make it small. December arrived with cold that had real teeth in it. The plains winter was not gentle. It came in across hundreds of miles of open country with nothing to stop it, and by mid-December there were mornings when the water in the pump had to be coaxed out with warm water poured down the casing, and the frost was thick on the windows, and the kitchen had to be warm before 6 in the morning when the household began to rise. Ada found she liked the work of a winter household. There was something satisfying about the cold at her back, and the stove warm at her front, and the smell of breakfast filling the house before the children came downstairs. She and Wesley saw each other when the weather permitted, which was most Saturdays but not all. There were 2 weeks in December when the roads were not sensible, and she stayed at the Hobbs ranch and he stayed at his, and she found herself thinking about him with a consistency that was both distracting and, in a strange way, company. She thought about his voice, which was low and unhurried and never changed pitch the way some men's voices did when they were angry or showing off. She thought about the way he listened, with his whole attention. She thought about his hands and his shelves and Hector eating beans in the garden. On Christmas, Henry Hobbs gave the children modest presents, and Ada cooked a feast: roasted chicken and sweet potatoes, and 3 different kinds of pie, and a pudding that required more work than the rest of the meal combined. And they sat around the table, the four Hobbses and Ada, and it felt enough like a family that Ada had to look out the window for a moment to collect herself. Sam climbed into her lap after dinner with a sleepy automaticity that suggested he did not know he was doing it, and she held him and did not say anything, and Henry Hobbs looked at her across the table with his grief-worn face and nodded once, and she nodded back. Wesley came in the last week of December, when the roads had cleared enough, and they walked the frozen main street of Caldwell in the cold, their breath coming white, and he told her about Christmas alone at the Ranch Hector and cold chicken, and a book he had been meaning to read since summer. And she told him about the pudding and Sam, and he listened to the part about Sam with the particular attention of a man filing something away carefully. On New Year's Eve, they were at Mabel's, which was full and loud and warm with the brightness of a town choosing celebration, and Wesley looked at her across their corner table and said, "What do you want, Ada, for this year coming?" What do you actually want? Nobody had asked her that before. Not in the whole of her adult life had someone asked what she wanted as though her answer was the important thing in the conversation. She was quiet for a long moment, turning her coffee cup in her hands. "I want a place that is mine," she said finally. "A home. Children around me, not necessarily mine, but people to cook for, to matter to. I want to stop moving." She looked up at him. "I have been moving for so long." He looked at her steadily. "That's what you want?" "Yes." "Good," he said, in the same way he had said it in his kitchen in November. And then, after a pause that held a quality she could feel, "Because I am going to ask you to marry me, Ada Reed. Not tonight, not yet. I want to do it properly, but I want you to know that is where I am headed so you can decide how you feel about it and there are no surprises." Ada stared at him. Outside, the sounds of Caldwell's New Year's Eve voices and music and someone discharging a pistol into the sky at midnight drifted through the walls of the boarding house, marking the turn of 1880. "You are telling me in advance," she said. "I am telling you in advance," he confirmed. "Because I would rather you have time to think than ask you in a moment and have you say yes when you are not sure." She looked at him for a long time. The lamplight was warm and the room was loud, and she was 24 years old and she was not unsure. "I am not going to need very long to think," she said, the something adjacent to a smile. "I know," he said, "but take the time anyway." January passed in cold and work and the growing certainty of something already decided. Ada told June, who was not surprised in the way that perceptive 14-year-olds are often not surprised by things they have been watching for months. June said, "He seems steady." Ada said that was her assessment too. June looked out the kitchen window and said, "You'll still come and see us, won't you?" And Ada said, "I will be 4 miles away and I will come every week." And June nodded as though this were a contractual arrangement she intended to hold Ada to, which Ada believed absolutely she intended to do. She told Henry Hobbs, who received the news with the gravity he gave to all significant information, turned it over a few times and said, "Keene's land is good land. He works hard." Then he looked at his hands. "The children will miss you." "I will not be far," Ada said, "and I will help you find someone else." "It won't be the same," he said, which was as close to an expression of personal feeling as Henry Hobbs was likely to manage, and she valued it accordingly. Sam cried. He cried in the particular silent way of a child who does not entirely understand what is happening but understands it is a change, and Ada sat with him on the porch steps in the January cold and held him and said, "I am going to be right over that hill, Sam, and you can come and see me. And I am going to come and see you, and nothing important is going away." He wiped his face with his sleeve and said, "You promise?" And she said, "I promise," and she meant it with every clear intention she had. On the first Saturday of February, 1880, Wesley came to the Hobbs ranch rather than meeting her in town. He came in the morning, which was not their usual time, and he knocked at the front door, which was also not their usual arrangement. And when Ada opened it, he was standing on the porch in his good jacket. She recognized the jacket as one he wore only for town, with his hat in his hand and his face entirely serious. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He looked at her and said, "I told you I would do this properly." And then he said, without preamble or extended preamble, because he was Wesley Keene and directness was his language, "Ada Reed, will you marry me?" Ada stood in the doorway of the Hobbs house with the February wind at her back and the man she had been falling toward since September standing on the porch, and she thought about a road in Caldwell in the heat of summer, and a woman walking past a boarding house twice, and the voice that had said, with no obligation attached, "Have you eaten today?" "Yes," she said. "I will." He put his hat back on a specific, considered gesture, the act of a man resettling himself after something significant, and then he came up the porch step and kissed her, briefly and carefully, with a gentleness that was characteristic and right, and she put her hand on his chest and felt his heart, which was not as steady as his face. They were married in March, at the small church in Caldwell that served the community in the absence of anything more formal. It was not a large wedding. Mabel came, and Caleb, the neighbor who had watched the ranch, and the Hobbs family, all four of them, Henry in his best coat and June with her hair up and Thomas looking barely contained in a clean shirt, and Sam holding Ada's hand until the ceremony started, and she had to take her place at the front of the church. The preacher was a young man who had been in Caldwell less than a year, and who conducted ceremonies with an earnestness that Ada found entirely appropriate to the occasion. She wore her best dress. It was dark blue, not white, because she was practical about these things, and she carried a few dried wildflowers that June had found pressed in her mother's Bible, and had offered with a gravity that Ada understood to be an immense and sacred offering. And she stood beside Wesley Keene in the small Kansas church with the March light coming through the plain glass windows, and said the words that needed to be said in a clear, steady voice, and he said them back in his low, unhurried way. And she looked at his face, and saw there something she had been looking for without knowing she was looking for it, the expression of a man who was exactly where he chose to be. They went home to the ranch afterward. Mabel had sent more food than two people could reasonably consume, pies and bread and a roasted ham, and Caleb raised a glass of whiskey on the porch and declared the occasion suitably marked and rode home, and the afternoon settled into the particular quiet of two people alone in a house that now belonged to both of them. Ada stood in the kitchen, her kitchen now, and looked at the shelves Wesley had built, level and sturdy and slightly imperfect. She looked at the south window and the view of the hills. She looked at the good stove and the solid table and the room that held, in its plain construction, the evidence of years of a person trying to make something from what they had. Wesley came and stood beside her. He did not say anything. He reached out and took her hand, which he held in the straightforward way he did most things, and they stood in the kitchen of their home in the March afternoon, and the plains outside were enormous and the sky was every shade of blue there was. "Wesley," she said. "Ada," he said. "I was going to keep walking," she said, "past you. I had decided you were not my business." "I know," he said. "What made you stop?" she asked. It was the question she had been carrying since that August afternoon in the dust, and she asked it now with the particular ease of a woman who has the rest of her life to hear the answer. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You had your jaw set in that way you have, like you were carrying something heavy and had decided not to put it down. I recognized that." He looked at her. "I spent a long time carrying things alone because I thought that was the requirement. I did not want to see someone else doing it who did not have to." Ada looked at him for a long moment. "We are a pair," she said. "We are," he said. And the smile was there, the full and real smile that she had learned was not common, but was, when it came, entirely genuine. "Good," she said. Spring came to the Kansas plains in the way it always did, gradually, and then all at once, the brown grass going green over the course of 2 weeks in a transformation that still struck Ada as slightly miraculous. She planted the kitchen garden in April, a proper one this time, with beans in their place and tomatoes and corn, and the kitchen herbs she had always managed to grow wherever she had been. Hector observed the planting with intense and suspicious interest and had to be redirected several times. She helped with the cattle work, not because it was expected, but because there were things to be done and two pairs of hands were more useful than one. And she had always been someone who showed up for work that needed doing. She learned the particular rhythms of the ranch's small herd. The animals had names, which Wesley denied giving them but which he used consistently and without apparent irony. And she learned the geography of the land, the places where the grass was best, and the places where the ground went soft in wet weather, and the low ridge to the south where you could see for miles in all directions on a clear day. Wesley was not a man given to many words about feelings, but he showed his love in the way of someone who had learned that actions were more reliable than words. He rebuilt the porch because she had mentioned that one of the boards was soft, and he added a shelf in the bedroom because she needed a place for her things. And when she was ill for 3 days in April with a head cold that laid her flat, he made a soup so full of effort and so lacking in skill that she had to keep her face very neutral while eating it. And when she could not keep her face neutral any longer, she laughed, and he watched her laugh with an expression so unguarded and content that she thought she could spend the rest of her life looking at it. She went to the Hobbs ranch every week, as she had promised. She brought food when she could, bread and pies and cookies for Sam, who had gotten into the habit of waiting on the fence post near the road when he knew she was coming. Henry Hobbs was managing better. He had hired a neighbor woman to come in 3 days a week for the heavy work, and June had taken on more responsibility in the kitchen with the competence of someone who had been watching and learning for years. Thomas had developed an interest in cattle management that Henry was beginning to treat with careful seriousness. Sam was growing. In early June, Ada told Wesley that she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen in the morning with the directness that was her natural language and that she had learned was also his. He stood very still for a moment, the coffee cup partway to his mouth, and she watched something move across his face, surprise, and then something she could only describe as a deep, flooding gladness. He set down the coffee cup. He crossed the kitchen and put his hands on either side of her face with a carefulness she had come to know, the particular precision of a man for whom care is a considered act, and he looked at her for a long moment without speaking, and then he said, "Ada." "I know," she said. "We are going to have a child," he said, as though the fact required repeating in order to become fully real. "We are," she said. He kissed her, and she felt the gladness in him, and it met the gladness she had been holding in her chest since she had been certain. And they stood in the kitchen in the June morning with the sound of the prairie outside the window and something new and enormous settling into the house around them. He was attentive in the way she had expected, and also in ways she had not. He rearranged the heavy work without being asked, not by stopping her from things. He was too sensible to try that, but by being present at the times when the heavy things needed doing, making it collaborative rather than solitary. He came with her on her weekly visits to the Hobbs ranch, which had the added effect of allowing Sam to attach to him in the way Sam attached to people he had decided were worth his loyalty, which was a significant and not casual determination. Sam had Wesley's full regard in return. Wesley talked to Sam the same way he talked to everyone, without condescension, with actual attention, and Ada watched this friendship develop with a warmth she did not try to contain. The summer was long and good. The cattle work was manageable, the garden produced abundantly, and Hector finally made his peace with the beans by transitioning his interest to the tomatoes, which Ada had not seen coming. She wrote a letter to the aunt in Texas whose name she had recalled, Margaret, her mother's sister, and the aunt wrote back, and a correspondence began that was halting and tentative in the way of two people who are family by blood but strangers by experience, trying to find what they actually had in common. It turned out to be more than she expected. The aunt was practical and dry-humored, and had opinions about everything, and Ada found herself looking forward to the letters. The town of Caldwell continued its particular commerce of the cattle season. There was a new mercantile that opened in July, and Mabel expanded her dining room by knocking out a wall, and there were the usual troubles and entertainments that came with a busy trail town, fights in saloons, disputes over cattle counts, the occasional flash of violence that was the dark underside of frontier life. Ada and Wesley were not much involved in the town's wilder aspects. They were people who kept to their work and their land and their circle, and the town accepted this as a reasonable way to be. It was October, the 2nd October, Ada's first full autumn at the ranch, when her neighbor Caleb Marsh stopped by one afternoon to let Wesley know that there had been a dispute 2 properties over about a water source, the kind of grazing rights argument that was common in cattle country, and that could escalate badly if not addressed. Wesley went to talk to the man, a rancher named Duggan who had been in the area longer than most and who had a reputation for insisting on his rights with considerable force. Ada went with him, which he did not try to prevent, and which she thought showed good judgment on his part. What happened at Duggan's place was essentially a conversation that required patience and the willingness to acknowledge competing claims. The kind of conversation that Ada, who had spent her life navigating situations with very little power, was unexpectedly good at. She said, very quietly, from the edge of the conversation, that the water source in question was seasonal, and that if it was shared properly, there was likely enough for both properties in the high water months, and that she had seen the survey markers on their property's east edge, and that they likely needed a formal arrangement of some kind to make it clear. Duggan looked at her the way men in cattle country often looked at women who said practical things, with a mix of surprise and the dawning recognition that the practical thing was in fact the right thing, and the conversation shifted. They reached an agreement before sundown. Duggan was not a warm man, but he was not dishonest, and the arrangement held. On the ride home, Wesley was quiet for a long stretch and then said, "That was well done." "You would have gotten there," she said. "Later," he said. And with more argument, he looked at her with that particular quality of attention. "You are very good at knowing what a situation needs." "I have had a great deal of practice at situations that needed careful management," she said. "I know," he said. "I am glad your practice is for us now." She looked at him in the October dusk, this man who had stopped on a road for no good reason and asked a simple question, and had thereby changed the direction of her entire life. And she thought that the measure of a person was not in the grand gestures but in the small ones, the stops, the questions, the soups made with effort and no skill, the hands held in the dark on New Year's Eve. Their son was born in late January of 1881, in the middle of a Kansas winter that had decided to make an argument of itself. The birth was managed by a midwife from town, a capable woman named Mrs. Greer, who arrived in a buckboard through 6 inches of snow, and proceeded with the calm efficiency of someone who had been managing births in worse conditions for 20 years. Wesley remained near enough to be of use without being where he would be in the way, which Mrs. Greer observed approvingly as evidence of unusually good sense. They named him Daniel James Keene. Daniel for no one in particular, but because it was a name that felt solid and right, and James for Wesley's father, whose name was the one good thing Wesley carried from his Missouri childhood. He was a large, healthy, opinionated baby from the beginning, with Ada's dark eyes and Wesley's habit of regarding the world with a focused, assessing calm that was entirely characteristic of both of his parents. The ranch absorbed the arrival of Daniel in the way that honest working households absorb children, by making room, making use, and finding that the addition of a small demanding person has the interesting effect of clarifying what matters. Wesley was a father with the same qualities he brought to everything: present, attentive, unhurried, unfrightened by the practical demands of the work. He got up at night. Not every night. Ada was clear that she needed to do her share of it and would not be managed out of it. But on his nights, he got up without complaint and came back to bed smelling of warm baby and looked at her in the dark with the expression she loved best. Sam Hobbs was enchanted by Daniel. He came with his father and siblings on the Sunday visits that had become a fixed part of the week's rhythm, and he appointed himself Daniel's most serious advocate and observer. And Daniel, who was perceptive about people from very early, had the good judgment to smile at Sam specifically, which cemented the relationship entirely. Henry Hobbs held the baby on the first visit carefully, with the hands of a man who had held babies before and whose hands remembered how, and looked at his face for a long moment and said, "He's a good one," which Ada understood to be a significant endorsement from Henry Hobbs and accepted it as such. June was 17 now, and had become something Ada thought of with enormous private pride, capable and clear-eyed and kind in the way of someone who had been through difficulty and had chosen to let it make her larger rather than smaller. She was going to be fine. She was already fine. Ada told her so, on an afternoon in March when June had helped her with laundry while Daniel slept in his cradle by the window, and June had given her the particular look of a young woman who needed to hear things said plainly and was glad when they were. Spring of 1880, one moved through the Kansas plains with its usual confidence, greening everything, and the ranch came to life in the way Ada had now seen twice, but did not expect to stop finding remarkable. The garden went in with the assistance of Daniel, who was not yet 3 months old, and whose contribution was primarily to be carried around the garden in a sling while Ada planted, regarding the bean rows with what she interpreted as thoughtful interest. Hector the dog had transferred his affections entirely to Daniel, sleeping beside the cradle with the dedication of a creature who has found his purpose. Ada wrote to her Aunt Margaret in Texas and described the spring, and the baby, and the view from the south window, and the way Wesley had rebuilt the porch, and the dog and the beans. Her aunt's reply came in May and was long and warm, and contained an offer to visit in the fall if the roads were manageable, which Ada received with a feeling she had not anticipated, the filling in of a gap she had stopped noticing because she had lived with it so long. Margaret came in September. She was a small, decisive woman in her 60s with her sister's eyes, Ada's mother's eyes, which Ada had not seen on another face in 8 years, and she arrived with no ceremony and a large number of practical opinions, and took to Daniel with the particular energy of a woman who had no grandchildren of her own and had been saving up. She and Wesley regarded each other with a mutual caution for approximately the first 6 hours, and then reached some invisible accord, as people of similar practicality often do when they have had time to take each other's measure, and after that they were allies in most things. She stayed 3 weeks. On the night before she left, she sat with Ada at the kitchen table after the household had gone to sleep, and they talked in the way that Ada and her mother had talked on good nights when Ada was a girl, with ease and honesty, and the specific warmth of women in a family talking to each other without performance. Margaret said things about Ada's mother that Ada did not know, small vivid things, her laugh, her opinions about weather, the particular way she made a pie crust, and Ada held these pieces carefully, fitting them into the space where her mother had been, filling in the outline. "Your mother would have loved him," Margaret said, meaning Wesley. "I know," Ada said. "She would have loved this whole life," Margaret said. She looked around the kitchen, at the shelves Wesley had built, at the cradle near the stove where Daniel was sleeping, at the garden visible through the window in the moonlight. "She worked so hard for you to have something like this." Ada was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I almost did not let it happen. I almost kept walking." Margaret looked at her. "But you did not." "I did not," Ada said. "He asked a question and I answered it." "That's how it usually starts," Margaret said with the dry simplicity of someone who has lived long enough to know the shape of things. Someone stops, someone answers. After Margaret left, the fall settled into the ranch the way falls did, cooling, golden, the grass going tawny, the sky clearing to that enormous blue of autumn that had nothing tentative in it. Daniel was 9 months old and had taken a decisive interest in movement, pulling himself toward anything that interested him with a focused determination that both his parents recognized as absolutely characteristic. Hector viewed this development with a combination of patience and self-preservation. Wesley had been talking about adding to the herd, a careful, steady expansion, the kind of growth that was built on what the land could actually sustain. He had a deal in mind with a rancher south of Caldwell for 4 additional head, which would bring them to 16 and begin to make the cattle operation genuinely productive rather than merely supplementary. He went over the numbers with Ada at the kitchen table on a November evening, because he had learned early in their marriage that she had a clear head for practical calculation, and that she would tell him if something didn't add up, which she had done twice to his benefit already. She went over the figures and agreed that the deal was sound, and they had the particular pleasure of 2 people making decisions about their future together, with the knowledge that the foundation beneath them was solid. The deal went through in December. The 4 head arrived, a little thin from the sale journey but sound, and the herd stood at 16 and the ranch had moved into a new phase. Wesley marked the occasion by being quietly pleased about it, which was his version of celebration, and Ada made the cake she had made for the Hobbs children on her first night at the ranch, because certain things deserved to be marked by something sweet. Christmas of 1881 was full. The Hobbs family came for dinner, all 4 of them, and Henry Hobbs brought a bottle of whiskey and the expression of a man who had made it through the worst year of his life and was still standing, which Ada thought was worth celebrating. Margaret had sent a package from Texas, books for Wesley, fabric for Ada, and for Daniel a carved wooden horse that had clearly been made by someone's hands, and that Margaret had attached a note to saying it had been carved by a man in her town, and that she had selected it specifically because it had a white blaze on its forehead like a certain horse she had met. Ada showed it to Wesley. She noticed Juniper, he said, which was the first time Ada had heard him name the horse aloud, which she filed away with all the other small specific things she kept about him. She notices everything, Ada said. She is exactly who you would expect her to be, given whose sister she was. Wesley looked at her. You look like your mother, you know. June showed me the photograph you keep in the bedroom. Ada looked at him. That photograph is very small. It is, he said, but the jaw is the same, the way you said it when you are carrying something and have decided not to put it down. She laughed because it was true and because the way he said it made it into something she did not need to be ashamed of. You recognized it, she said. In Caldwell, in August. That is why you stopped. That is why I stopped, he said. They looked at each other across the kitchen table with the sounds of the Hobbs children and Daniel and Hector and Henry Hobbs telling Thomas something emphatic about cattle all around them. And Ada Keene. She reminded herself, and it still had the quality of something new even after nearly 2 years thought about roads and dust and the weight of 3 copper pennies and the voice that had simply, plainly, without any requirement attached, asked if she had eaten. Thank you for stopping, she said. He reached across the table and took her hand. Thank you for answering, he said. The winter of 1881 into 1882 was milder than the previous year, and the ranch made good use of the easier conditions. Wesley fenced a new section of the east pasture, expanding the grazing range for the growing herd. Ada had the kitchen garden planned out for spring with the precision of someone who had spent a full year learning what grew well in this particular piece of Kansas, what the soil liked, and what the sun's angle meant for the south beds, and which direction the wind came from and dried things too fast. She had a system now, and she was proud of it in the quiet, non-announced way she was proud of things she had built by paying attention. Daniel began walking in February, with the comprehensive confidence of a child who had been watching the technique for 9 months and had decided he had it sufficiently analyzed to proceed. He walked directly into the kitchen table on his 3rd independent step, assessed the table, and walked around it on his 4th, which Wesley observed from the doorway with an expression that Ada thought might be the most purely happy expression she had ever seen on a human face. June Hobbs came to visit on her own in March, riding over on the horse her father had given her for her 15th birthday. She was 18 now, and she was, Ada thought, exactly who she had always been going to be: strong and perceptive and capable, the grief of her mother's absence woven into her rather than weighing her down. She sat at Ada's kitchen table and drank coffee and talked about the future with the particular focused energy of a young woman who has figured out that the future is hers to arrange. She wanted to go to school. There was a women's seminary in Lawrence that she had read about that offered real academic instruction, not merely the domestic curriculum that most institutions thought appropriate for girls. Henry Hobbs, to his credit, had not dismissed it. He was thinking about it, June said, with the careful honesty she brought to everything. He was considering it. He will agree, Ada said. You think so? Your father loves you, Ada said. He is a practical man, and he is also a grieving one, and the two things have been in conflict. But he loves you, and if you tell him plainly what you want, he will find his way to yes. June was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup. Will you talk to him? No, Ada said. This one is yours to do. You do not need me to carry it. She paused. But I will be right behind you if you need me. June went home that afternoon, and the following Sunday she told her father she wanted to go to school in Lawrence, and Henry Hobbs was quiet for a very long time, and then said he would write to the seminary and ask about arrangements. Ada heard this from June the next week with a satisfaction so complete she could feel it in her bones. Spring of 1882. The garden went in, and the herd was 20 now, and Wesley had a second hand helping on the property, a young man named Eli who was 17, and who had come through looking for work with the same combination of scarcity and determination that Ada recognized from her own history, and whom Wesley had hired on the immediate practical grounds that there was work and the boy was willing. Ada sometimes caught Wesley looking at Eli the way he had looked at her on that road in August 3 years ago, with the particular recognition of someone who had been where you are now. She did not say anything about it because it did not need to be said. She just watched and was glad and thought about the way things moved forward when people stopped. Daniel was 14 months old and in full command of all horizontal surfaces within reach, and had opinions about food that were already impressively specific, and which Ada found hilarious in proportion to their seriousness. He liked beans. He did not care for carrots. He regarded Hector as his best and oldest friend, which Hector accepted with the solemn dignity of an animal who understands the weight of such a commitment. On an afternoon in April, Ada stood at the south window of the kitchen and looked out at the hills and the garden and the east pasture where Wesley was working with the cattle, and she thought about the woman who had walked that road in August of 1879 with 3 copper pennies and a canvas bag, and the absolute conviction that she was nobody worth stopping for. She thought about that woman with a kind of love, not pity, but love for how far she had walked and how hard she had tried and how completely wrong she had been about herself. She heard the front door, which was Wesley coming in from the field for water, and she did not turn right away, just listened to the familiar sounds of him, the particular way he moved, the creak of the pump, his voice saying something to Eli outside. Then he came into the kitchen and she turned, and he looked at her standing at the south window the way she sometimes stood there, and he came and stood beside her the way he sometimes did, and they looked out at the hills and the light moved across the Kansas land. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am very all right," she said. "I was thinking." "What about?" She looked at him. "About August," she said. 3 years ago." He nodded slowly. In Caldwell," she said. "I was going to keep walking." "I know," he said. "What if you had not stopped?" she asked, not with anxiety she knew how it had gone, but with the curiosity of someone who keeps looking at the hinge point because it still amazes her. Wesley was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the hills and then at the garden and then at her with that careful, open, unhurried quality she had loved since she learned to recognize it. "I was not going to stop," he said. "I was tired and I wanted to eat, and I was not in the business of other people's situations." He paused. "And then I saw your jaw." "My jaw," she said. "The way you said it," he said. "Like you were holding the whole weight of something and had decided it was yours to carry alone." He looked at her. "I know that weight. I carried it for years." Another pause. I thought maybe I could just ask one thing. And if you told me to mind my business, I would." "I very nearly did," she said. "I know," he said, and the smile was there. She leaned against him, her shoulder to his chest, and he put his arm around her, and they stood at the south window of their house in the April light, and the land spread out before them. Their land, their garden, their cattle in the east pasture, Hector sleeping in a patch of sun near the fence, Daniel napping in the next room, the south hills amber and the sky its enormous blue. All of it built from a stop on a dusty road and a simple question asked without obligation, answered by a woman who had decided she was nobody and been wrong. She was somebody. She had always been somebody. She had just needed one person to stop and ask, and to mean it. In the summer of 1882, Wesley made an addition to the house, a second room off the back, because it had become clear that their household was going to require it. Ada was expecting again, which she had told him on a June morning at the kitchen table with the same direct simplicity as the first time, and he had done the same thing he had done the first time, held very still for a moment, and then crossed the kitchen, and this time she could feel his heart the whole way. The room was finished by September, and it was good work, solid walls and a proper window and shelves along one side that were, he noted privately, better than the first set, because 3 years of practice had improved his technique. Ada ran her hand along the shelves and nodded approval. Margaret came again in October, this time with the specific stated intention of being present for the birth if she timed it right, and she did time it right because she stayed until December, and the baby came in November. A girl this time, born in the new room on a clear November morning when the frost was on the windows, and the stove was warm, and Mrs. Greer was there again with her calm efficiency and her appreciation for Wesley's sensible management of himself. They named her Clara Margaret Keene, Clara because it was the name Ada had always thought she would give a daughter, and Margaret for the woman sitting in the kitchen drinking coffee, and pretending she was not listening very hard for the sound from the back room. When Ada called her in to see the baby, Margaret stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the small dark-haired child in the crook of Ada's arm, and then she came to the bedside and sat, and Ada watched her gray-tant look at Clara's face, and she saw her mother there again briefly, in the way your mother lives on in things that come from your own body and your own life, and she was grateful for it. Wesley was in the room, sitting in the chair in the corner. He had Daniel on his lap, Daniel, who was 22 months old and was regarding the new situation with the focused analytical attention that was entirely his father's. And Wesley was talking to him quietly, explaining Clara with the seriousness he brought to all explanations, and Daniel was listening with his whole face. Ada looked at them, her husband, her son, her daughter, her gray-tant whose presence filled in a piece of her mother, and looked at the room with its solid shelves and its south window, and she thought, This is what a home is. Not the walls, not the acres, not the money saved or the herd grown. The people in it, the choosing to stay. Clara grew. Daniel grew. Hector grew older, slower, more certain of his own importance. Eli, the young man Wesley had taken on, stayed through the seasons and became as much a part of the ranch as the fences he helped build. And when he turned 19, he asked Wesley with visible nerves if he could stay on permanent, and Wesley said yes without making him wait a day. Ada fed him steadily, and he filled out and lost the gaunt look that had been on him when he arrived. And she watched this happen with the same private satisfaction she had watched Daniel walk his first confident circle around the kitchen table. June Hobbs went to school in Lawrence in the fall of 1883. Henry Hobbs drove her himself in the wagon and came back quieter than usual, but with a rightness about him, the look of a man who had done a hard and correct thing. She wrote letters, long, vivid, specific letters, about her classes and her professors and the other women there, and the town and the library. And Ada read them at the kitchen table and felt the specific pride of someone who had watched a thing grow from its beginning. Thomas had taken over much of the ranch work from his father, who was beginning to let him, and Sam was 11 and had grown into a boy of considerable gravity and occasional wild humor that he deployed at intervals to magnificent effect. He still came to see Ada every week. He had taken to Daniel and Clara with the protective seriousness of a child who had been waiting for younger siblings and was not going to waste the opportunity. On a Sunday afternoon in the autumn of 1883, Ada and Wesley rode out to the low ridge south of the ranch, the one he had shown her in that first November, the place where you could see for miles. They went alone, which they did sometimes when Eli could watch the children and the afternoon was clear. They sat on the ridge with the horses grazing behind them and the land open before them in all directions, the flat golden grassland, the far blue line of the hills, the enormous sky doing what the Kansas sky did, which was to fill itself with light in a way that made you feel very small and very fortunate. For years, Ada said. She did not mean the marriage, though that was 4 years also. She meant from the beginning, from Caldwell, from the road, from the first question. 4 years, Wesley agreed. I would like another 10, she said. He looked at her. At least, he said. At least, she agreed. They sat on the ridge in the October afternoon, with the horses behind them and the land and sky before them. And Ada Keene, still new feeling after 4 years. Still something she took out and turned in her hands, sometimes with the wonder of someone who has been given a thing they did not know to ask for, thought about roads and hunger, and the specific grace of being seen when you had decided you were invisible. She had walked into Caldwell with nothing. 3 pennies and a worn canvas bag, and the absolute conviction that she was nobody worth stopping for. And she had been wrong in the most complete and irreversible way, wrong in the way that turns out to be the best possible thing to have been wrong about, wrong in the way that changes everything. He had stopped. He had asked if she had eaten. She had answered. The rest was Kansas sky and South Hills and Daniel sitting in his father's lap learning the names of stars, and Clara in the new room growing and growing, and Hector sleeping in the kitchen with his chin on his paws and one ear cocked for sounds of interest, and the shelves along the kitchen wall, level and sturdy and slightly imperfect, made by someone learning through practice, which was the way all the best things were made. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole world, held in the palm of a piece of Kansas land where the grass grew green in spring and the sky was blue past measuring, and a man with a faded shirt had stopped on a road one August afternoon because he recognized the weight someone was carrying and had simply asked. She looked at him beside her on the ridge, and he was looking at the land the way he looked at everything, steady, open, unhurried, and she thought, there is nobody in the world I would rather sit on a ridge with, nobody I would rather build shelves with, nobody I would rather be wrong with in all the ways that matter. Wesley, she said. He turned. I love you, she said. She said it in the flat, direct way she said things that were important without embellishment, meaning every syllable of it. He held her gaze for a moment, and the smile was there, the full, genuine, rare one that changed his whole face, and he said, I know, and then, I love you, Ada. And he said it the same way she had, plain and honest and complete. The sun moved west across the Kansas sky. The horses grazed behind them. Below on the flat land, 4 miles north, the ranch house sat solid in the autumn light with its south window and its garden and its new room and the life inside it. They rode home before dark. They always rode home.